Escalation has been the name of the game in Eastern Europe for 4 years now, and the Western approach to it has been, interesting. European countries were slow to react to the Kremlin's moves. Meanwhile, the United States also received plenty of criticism for operating too slowly under the Biden administration, before doing however you want to describe the policy under the second Trump administration. And though the war is not yet over, we at least know enough about what happened earlier on to pass some judgments regarding how the West reacted. So pick up the phone, because we are about to enter today's geopolitics helpline. At the beginning of the Ukraine war, there was a lot of talk from Western powers about wanting to offer Ukraine only limited help in fear of escalation from Russia. Considering the developments in the war since then, it seems like the Kremlin's threats were mostly bluffs. Is this an example of an information asymmetry creating a bargaining friction? Yes, it is evidence of an information asymmetry at work. Like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care while I use my extra free time today to slay some spires. Meh. For those of you still with me, I think we can use this as a jumping off point to reflect back on what happened during those early phases of the war, and retrospectively examine where the West might have gone wrong. However, to do this fairly, I need to start with three major criticisms of the West. First, it is easy to retrospectively look back at geopolitical strategies and point out their flaws. It is also tempting to praise individuals who are advocating for what is now recognized as the right policy choice, as being smarter than those who were actually in charge. However, none of the people who made those recommendations at the time were privy to the intelligence that the actual policymakers had. Government officials have to maximize based on what they know when they know it. It is possible that a keyboard warrior advocated for one position, but would have advocated for the opposite had he known what the government knew, and yet his original position was correct. I know, that was hard to follow. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine I am at a roulette table and bet $10,000 on red. You might think that is a silly decision. The odds of hitting are only 47.4%, so my expected value is $9,474. That is a losing bet, and we, as risk-neutral actors, would not want to needlessly lose money. But I know something that you do not know. The wheel is rigged. Red comes up 60% of the time. If you knew that, then you would agree with my decision. And yet, if the ball landed on black, your keyboard warrior recommendation would have been correct. Basically, this is another case where valuing outcome over process leads to bad inferences on who is making the sound strategic decisions when they need to be made. And yes, I will soon begin criticizing Western policymakers, mostly American, with a European or two along the way. But I do not want you to think that I can confidently say that we would have done any better had we been in those positions. The second major criticism of criticism is that the war itself changed over time, and, in particular, Russia's ability to retaliate to actions that the West took. Here is the structure of an argument that you will commonly come across. Finally, the West is providing X to Ukraine. I have been saying that we needed to do this for the last 3 years, and the White House always whines about escalation management. Well, guess what? We gave X to Ukraine now, and Russia did nothing in response. Thus, we could have been doing this all along. Opportunity lost. Sure, but 3 years ago, Russia had a lot more materiel on hand, and a much deeper pool of active soldiers and potential recruits. Part of the reason that the Kremlin might not be retaliating today is that it is just harder to retaliate now than it was before. Accordingly, we would expect the West to push the limits further without retribution, which is indeed what we have been seeing. The best that we can say here is that present evidence is a weak signal of what could have happened before. The final major criticism of criticism is one that has become a recurring theme on this channel. The problem is not necessarily Russia suddenly launching nuclear weapons at a European capital, or even less dramatic covert operations. The problem is narrative, that NATO has shown its true colors, and is using Ukraine as a proxy to set up invasion operations of the fatherland. Our recent discussions of this problem have focused on the Kremlin turning around and using this perception to stage an invasion of a NATO country. But there is a more pressing short-term problem where the Kremlin instead uses this narrative to step up efforts against Ukraine. Now, a skeptic might point out that this has not happened yet, and so there is no real concern there. And my response is, yes, the entire point of the caution is to prevent the Kremlin from succeeding with this narrative. The entire point of the strategy is to not broach the point where Putin could go back on television, announce a large mobilization, and not have it blow back in his face. Please cross-reference this with the point about how the underlying dynamics of the war are constantly changing, and so you still might want to adjust on account of that. Anyway, with those caveats out of the way, let's discuss what I see as 5 missteps that still deserve criticism, despite the earlier inference problems. Issue 1 might come as a surprise, given that the framing of the question might have been in regard to the 2022 invasion. But the first real unforced error came during the Obama administration. We watched Russia annex Crimea, and then do however you want to describe what happened with little green men in the Donbass. There was a war ongoing on the European continent, even if it did not involve Russians in regular uniforms. Nevertheless, Obama maintained a post-Cold War mindset that this was only a minor concern and not worth provoking Russia over. As a result, the United States only provided defensive aid to Ukraine. Perhaps with more, Kyiv would have dispatched the forces in the Donbass, and the rest of the dominoes would have never fallen. Misstep number 2 is easy to forget because of how much has happened involving Trump and Zelensky since then. But you remember how Trump was impeached the first time? Remember how that was over a perfect phone call with the then unknown Volodymyr Zelensky? Unlike Obama, Trump had started providing lethal aid to Ukraine. However, he froze that aid as a part of the impeachment scandal. This was for personal political gain. So maybe this was not a miscalculation on Trump's part, but it is certainly a misstep from the perspective of a Westerner wishing that Russian forces would return home. Misstep number 3 comes from across the Atlantic. I could point to a lot of European issues here, including the lack of will to bother doing anything of note involving a coalition of the willing. But I will be nice and chalk that up to what the intelligence says. Instead, let's go back to earlier in the war, when Germany was very slow to offer tanks to Ukraine. The reasoning that Schultz cited was optics. He did not like the idea of German tanks blitzing through the plains of Ukraine, conjuring up images of something similar from 80 years earlier. Now, one of 2 things is true. The first possibility is that this was simply an excuse. He either did not want to pay for it, or was otherwise wanting to exercise extreme escalation avoidance. Either way, not a good look. The second possibility is that he actually meant it, which is somehow worse, because it completely failed to internalize how we are all adults here, and this is not even remotely the same thing. And I am saying this as someone on the outside of the situation. I cannot imagine how many times Zelensky rolled his eyes whenever he heard that story. Misstep number 4 returns to my side of the Atlantic, and now the Biden administration is our focus. The most obvious problem with Biden-era policies relates to the incentive structure that he created when he prohibited Ukraine from using US weapons to strike targets inside of internationally recognized Russia. Again, that is the type of policy that may have been perfectly reasonable given the intelligence that he was receiving. The problem was sticking with the rule as though it were gospel. You see, Russia found a loophole that I think would be better suited for a professional wrestling plotline than actual geopolitics. The Kremlin started staging forces just north of the border to open up a new front just across it. Ukraine watched the troops accumulate and could not do what it needed to do to stop the attack. After all, that was the rule. They were on the other side of the border. Well, the Kremlin was clearly taking advantage of the rule in a manner that the United States did not intend. It was set so that the conflict stayed on Ukrainian soil. It was not set to facilitate Russia invading another part of Ukraine. But that is exactly what happened, and it took too long for the Biden administration to reverse course. The final failure is a lack of long-term planning from the Biden administration. Less so about Ukraine directly, and more so about US domestic politics. Even after the invasion began, US spending on military infrastructure lagged. It might not have been as bad as the bottom of the post-Cold War era, but the administration could have shifted to a Cold War II mindset sooner. Urgent action before the 2022 midterms would have also sidestepped problems with congressional Republicans later on. Even after the midterms, there was still a consensus involving Indo-Pacific security, or Israel, that could have made it work. Now, I cannot say that such proactive planning would have maintained the flow of US arms to Ukraine. But once you establish new systems, you create new special interests, specifically the people working in the associated factories. They do not want to lose jobs, and that makes it just a bit more difficult for the next president to flip the policy. I think that the concluding point here is that crafting the optimal level of coercion against an opponent is difficult, so I am less inclined to pass judgment than most. That is just what happens when the entire international system is set up so we do not know what the other side's breaking point is. And I have to say, after getting into a war with my video editing software yesterday, I almost reached a breaking point. But if you are seeing this, I guess I managed to survive. Check out the playlist of all of the Geopolitics Helpline videos while I go back into the trenches. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.